If you think about it, one of the reasons the United States was so successful in World War II is because we were able to ramp up production of things like ships at an enormous scale and build them out faster than anybody had ever built them in history. And now China accounts for about half of global commercial shipbuilding. Their shipyards are just enormous and they're growing. They're modernizing them even more. And so because they can really harness all of that capability for the commercial side, it also creates kind of downstream benefits for them on the naval side, and they can build destroyers and other vessels at a rate that currently the United States just can't reach. And in fact, things are actually getting worse, I think, in the United States.
This is an interview with Brian Hart, a researcher at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and an expert on Chinese military and its foreign and security policy. In this conversation, we talk about what is the real capability of the Chinese military after decades of investments and reforms. If it's just a paper tiger, or if it's prepared to take Taiwan by force. How does it compare to the military of the United States? Or whether 2027 is the year when we might expect the war to happen. Thank you to everyone who supports this podcast on Patreon. And now, enjoy the conversation. So, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So, let's talk first about the Chinese military, because the People's Liberation Army has been going through some pretty intense reforms for quite a while now, at least over a decade. And it has been receiving continually increasing funding, a lot of support from the political leadership, but I think it's still a little bit of maybe a black box as to what is the real state of the Chinese military today after all that effort that has been put into it. So in your view, as someone who's been working on this quite a lot, what is the shape and state of the Chinese military today, and how capable and combat ready they are?
It's a great question, and it's a hard one to answer. I would say, so some of the recent reforms of the PLA really kind of started in their nascent form in the 1990s. You saw the PLA learn a lot from the U.S. Successful execution of the Gulf War in the early 1990s, like the new kind of revolution of technology for that. Precision-guided munitions were really impactful there. The PLA learned a lot from that. They also learned a lot from the 1995-1996 Taiwan Strait crisis, where the U.S. was able to send significant military forces to the region, and China saw itself as not really having those capabilities to kind of push back against the U.S. So I think that those and a couple of other developments really kickstarted the Chinese leadership into wanting to reform and modernize the PLA. So you saw a lot of efforts to do that in the 90s and the 2000s, and then that really also accelerated significantly under Xi Jinping, who came to power in late 2012. Under him, he's had significantly more influence over the PLA than his predecessor, Hu Jintao, and he's used that to significant effect. So he really launched a comprehensive reform of the PLA in terms of structure, reforming the combatant commands, essentially, that they have, the theater commands there, elevating the services of the PLA rocket force, and reducing the size of the army. So just a suite of different reforms to bring the PLA into the 21st century. And a lot of those reforms are still underway. I think in terms of capabilities, where the PLA really stands out is the pace at which it's been able to use its massive industrial base to build new capabilities. So being able to build dozens of warships per year, is just a really remarkable feat from their standpoint. I think on the capability side, again, we're seeing a lot of modernization, new destroyers, new, fifth generation aircraft, or four and a half generation aircraft, depending on how you want to see it. So a lot of modernization on that front in terms of equipment. I think where the PLA knows that it lags the most is in the training, the experience. They just have not been engaged in a significant military conflict since really the Vietnam border wars of the late 60s and 70s. So that lack of experience in combat is something that I think the PLA worries about the most. And that's still underway. That's why we see them doing a lot of training, and that's why we see them doing a lot of training around Taiwan, which I'm sure we'll touch on later. But that really is where they see themselves as lacking the most, and where I think they're investing a lot of time and energy, and frankly, where I think Xi Jinping sees the PLA as really lagging behind.
So I definitely want to dive into a lot of things that you've mentioned in more detail, from the industrial base to the lack of combat experience of the Chinese military as a whole. But I think a good way to maybe put it in context is to talk about, one, the main competitor of the Chinese military, and B, the main goal that it seems to be being prepared for. And maybe if we start with the first one, the main competitor, which is the United States, and maybe we look at comparison of the military capabilities of the two, because that can give us some sense of, you know, how far they managed to get with these reforms. What is, if we look at capabilities, what is the level of the Chinese military when compared with the United States? And are they any close to reaching military parity or even overtaking the US military in at least any domain?
It's a great question. So, no, the PLA is not, I think, at the same overall capability as the United States military. And the Chinese know that, and they will tell you that. So the Chinese actually have a series of modernization plans to get them to essentially at the level of the United States military. So right now they have a short-term goal set for 2027 to achieve some of the things like, make progress on things like what they call intelligentization, which is, the incorporation of things like AI and machine learning more significantly. Their medium goal is 2035, which is to essentially basically achieve modernization, basic modernization. So that means, really getting a lot of their reforms that were launched in recent years, accomplishing those, getting more of their equipment modernized, and more or less up to speed with what the U.S. capabilities have. Their long-term goal is to, by the middle of the century, to be what they call a world-class force. And that is, there's a lot of debate over what that exactly means, but I think most people generally agree that that's when the PLA wants to be at the same level, roughly, as the United States, kind of this premier military force. I think one area where I would highlight that the PLA has really succeeded is in their missile forces, the PLA rocket force. I think, the Chinese, the rocket force have really, I think, pretty much the largest and most diverse arsenal of conventional rocket forces in the world, really. And that's something that the U.S. has not built out in the same way in terms of, building medium and kind of long range conventional rockets, ballistic missiles. It's because if you think about what China's trying to do with their forces, it makes sense for them to focus on that. They're really focused on, what many call anti-access area denial. They basically want to make China as prickly as possible. They want to be able to hold at risk, enemy forces in their immediate periphery along basically the Western Pacific through the first and second island chains. And missiles are a really big part of that. So being able to hit naval forces in the region, being able to hit ground targets far from China with their missile forces. So that, to me, when I think about potential conflict with China, that is one of the things that I think is the most difficult. They have a significant magazine depth and a lot of capabilities at their disposal. I think outside of that, China really lags the United States in some key areas. They lead the U.S. in terms of quantity in many areas. For example, I'm sure many people will know that China's Navy has the largest number of vessels in the world. But if you go beyond that to look at not the number of vessels, but the kind of quality and size and capability of those vessels, I think the Chinese Navy is still significantly outmatched. A key example of that is China just now nearing completion of its third aircraft carrier, which is still conventionally powered, not nuclear powered. Whereas the U.S. for decades has fielded a fleet of about 10 or so. Right now we have 11 nuclear powered aircraft carriers, and those are able to project power globally, project air power around the world. China doesn't have that. That's not something that they currently, I think, see as being in their need. I think they're building aircraft carriers and other naval vessels to be able to really dominate again their periphery in places like the South China Sea, the East China Sea. And then I think the other big area that I would highlight again is the lack of combat experience, whereas China hasn't been in a major conflict for decades, where the PLA has had to really fight. The U.S. military has been fighting in conflicts large and small for decades, and has a lot of experience in fighting and executing wars. The one caveat I would add to that, though, for the United States is the last 2 decades have not been focused on great power wars. They've been focused on fighting, counterterrorism, counterinsurgency operations and things like that. That's not the same kind of capabilities or experience that applies in something like, a great power war over something like Taiwan. Those are different capabilities. Still, the U.S. has a lot more experience in that area. I would just highlight one more that I think is really significant and increasingly important, which is nuclear capabilities. For decades throughout the Cold War, the United States and Russia were and remain, the preeminent nuclear powers globally, and that's still the case. But I think that's changing pretty quickly as China really doubles down on modernizing its nuclear forces. We're seeing them significantly grow, basically doubling their nuclear arsenal over the last decade or so, with projections to perhaps reach something like 1,500 warheads by around 2035, and that would put them at something like a pretty near peer competitor in the nuclear space, just in terms of quantity. And so that's a big, I think, a pretty significant fundamental shift in the balance of nuclear power globally.
You've mentioned the lack of combat experience that disadvantages China in terms of military capabilities. I have also heard an opinion that it doesn't actually matter that much, because the kind of war that we would see in case of a conflict between the US and China is a type of war that the US doesn't actually have experience with neither, and that actually we've never seen before, because it would be different in terms of scale and level of technology, and it would be basically a near peer or a peer level war that the US, as you've said, hasn't really seen since the Second World War. And you could maybe even argue that the focus on the counterinsurgency over the past 2 decades has maybe swayed the way that the United States military works in some ways, and perhaps could even be a disadvantage. I wonder what's your view on that.
It's a good question. And I think there's a little bit of truth to it, in the sense that, yes, nobody has fought that kind of great power on great power war since essentially World War II. And of course, technology has changed the nature of warfare since then, in many ways. But I think the biggest thing I would say to counter that is war is also really about systems. It's, you can have the most advanced capabilities in the world, and you could have the most and the like highest quality. But if you don't have the systems to execute those, to conduct joint operations, to have, supporting systems like ISR and targeting, if you can't find your enemy, and then you can't hit them, no matter how many missiles you have. So I think that is where I think the United States has so much experience. We have our systems built up to conduct joint operations. We focused on jointness, a long time ago, and we've had more decades to integrate, joint operations, and increasingly, I think, networked operations into U.S. military thinking, into our command structure. China's really not had the chance to learn, get their hands dirty, so to speak, in actually learning about that. So really, they've had to learn from others. That's why they watch the United States so closely in terms of our military campaigns. That's why they watch Russia so closely, especially right now, Russia's both their successes and failures in Ukraine. And so I think for me, the United States still has a major advantage when it comes to systems and being able to kind of prosecute a campaign. But as you say, yeah, they're really, a great power war would be something that, people in this lifetime really just haven't seen. So that opens up a lot of space for, uh, you know, for China to potentially be on a more level playing field. But I think if I was on a fight right now, I think I would want to be on the U.S. side if I had to make that choice.
Then another aspect that where China might have an advantage, is one that you've already touched on, and that's the industrial base. And especially when it comes to shipbuilding, the advantage that China has over the United States is really, really extensive. I think that I can't recall the ratio right now, but it's really doesn't play well in the favor of the United States. And there is a possibility that in any war between the two powers, they would very quickly destroy a lot of its initial capabilities, and they would need to produce more in case the war drags on. And if it would come to that, then this would play against the United States. So how big of a problem do you think that this is for the US?
It's a great question. This is something I spend a lot of time thinking about, especially on the naval side of things, just because the work that we've done here at CSIS in tracking China's both commercial and military shipbuilding capabilities, which are just pretty much unparalleled in the world, and provide them a huge advantage, I think, in terms of just their sheer industrial capacity. I think there's a lot of ways that it cuts both ways. So I think if you look at the war in Ukraine, there's a big focus on. I said earlier that the technology has really changed kind of the nature of war. I think that's true, but if you look at Ukraine, some of the things that matter still are just artillery shells. Just being able to pump out sheer number of artillery shells. That is something certainly that I think China has a significant capacity to do, just because of how how large, how invested they are in their manufacturing capability. And I think their ability to scale that up is really significant. But it's one thing to build artillery shells. It's another thing to build advanced, more exquisite systems. That is certainly where the US still has the advantage, is in being able to design and produce these exquisite systems like the F-35, like the B-21 bomber, that are more advanced than what China can currently field right now in a lot of different ways. They're also way more expensive. So I think, we have different levels, I think different strengths and weaknesses. What I think China really, again, has a huge advantage in is the shipbuilding. And that one reason that that's the case is because they have really fused together their commercial and their military shipbuilding. And we've looked at this a lot with satellite imagery. So the same facilities that are producing China's third aircraft carrier at Jiangnan Shipyard in Shanghai, those same facilities are being used to build giant container ships for French companies, for other European companies, Japanese companies, and interestingly, Taiwanese shipping companies like Evergreen. It's kind of funny to see Taiwanese ships being constructed right next to Chinese aircraft carriers and destroyers. And now China accounts for about half of global commercial shipbuilding. Their shipyards are just enormous, and they're growing. They're modernizing them even more. And so because they can really harness all of that capability for the commercial side, it also creates kind of downstream benefits for them on the naval side. And they can build destroyers and other vessels at a rate that currently the United States just can't reach. And in fact, things are actually getting worse, I think, in the United States, because the Defense Department recently kind of released information showing that a lot of our kind of key ships that are supposed to be built in the coming years are all going to be delayed. That could change, but right now the picture is not very pretty. That's all a big problem, I think, for the United States. If we think back to if we think about the prospect of a kind of great power conflict, and it's also, if you think about it, one of the reasons the United States was so successful in World War II is because we were able to ramp up production of things like ships at an enormous scale and build them out faster than anybody had ever built them in history. And that was a key part of our success, and a key reason our opponents just weren't able to keep up with that. And so I think about that. And I think about the need to invest more in our industrial base and solve some of the bottleneck problems we have. It's a huge challenge. The last thing I'll say on this, though, that is a United States advantage is that at the end of the day, the United States is not on its own. We do have our NATO allies. We have Japan. We have South Korea, Australia, all with their own industrial bases as well. Including them building their own capabilities, but also joint production of certain systems with the United States. So that is one area where I think that is one way that I think the U.S. reduces some of its potential kind of strategic exposure on the industrial base is by networking with our allies, and that's becoming crucial. I think you see that with a lot of the moves that the Biden administration is taking on things like AUKUS to jointly produce attack submarines with Australia and the UK, increasingly working with Japan to produce different systems, aircraft, missile systems, and potentially even bringing Japan into portions of AUKUS, which was recently announced, although I have skepticism about how that will go. You see them thinking about this in terms of networking our industrial bases. And that's played a role in terms of supporting Ukraine, and I think it would certainly be a critical aspect if we were to have to, go into a fight in the Indo-Pacific.
So it sounds like, looking at the two powers, that on China's side the advantage is quantity, and on the US side the advantage is quality, and China is trying to catch up on the quality and the US is trying to catch up on the quantity, and we will just have to see what matters more in the end if it comes down to it. Would that be correct?
I think broad strokes, yeah, I do think that that's pretty correct. One of the things, though, that I think the United States is really, one way that we're thinking about the quantity issue too is through unmanned systems. And you see this in things like the Defense Department's Replicator initiative, which is currently working on building out, a fleet of large, or cheap and attritable drones. And I think the keywords there are cheap and attritable. Cheap in the sense that we can build a lot of them, and attritable in the sense that we can lose a lot of them. And I think that's partly a lesson of the war in Ukraine, is that in modern warfare, you do need systems that are attritable. You with the amount of money that you spend building one F-35, you can build a lot of cheap drones. So thinking about that, thinking about how to leverage new technologies to build things more cheaply. The Chinese are certainly paying attention to that. The Russians and the Ukrainians are certainly thinking about that right now. That's an area where I think the United States can potentially make big tangible gains in terms of our warfighting ability, and bring some of our capabilities more into, the 21st century in terms of just knowing how warfare works these days and how important drones are. I think that's one good example of how the U.S. is, I think, starting to think a lot about quantity.
There's also this idea that, sometimes is raised in the public debate that if you look at the factors like the lack of combat experience or the, extensive corruption that probably exists within the Chinese military, or, the emphasis on ideology and how that affects the combat capability, that if you look at all these factors, the Chinese military might be, despite its size, sort of a paper tiger. A military that looks strong on paper, but is actually much, much weaker in real life. And I wonder, what's your view on that?
It's a great question. I don't think I have the secrets to it or know exactly, what the answer is. But I actually think this is something that Xi Jinping and the leadership worries about. I think they're worried about the PLA in terms of training, in terms of personnel, I would highlight two main reasons. One is the corruption side of things. Corruption has been deeply endemic in the PLA for decades. It is better now, I think, than it was, mostly because Xi Jinping has ruthlessly, targeted the PLA for the broader party, but especially the PLA for anti-corruption campaigns. Yes, some of those were politically motivated. I think Xi Jinping used anti-corruption campaigns to kind of consolidate some of his, political power within the party and the state and the military. But they really, in the military, I think, were really I think Xi Jinping came in, saw the state of things in the military, and decided major change was needed to root out corruption. And that's, it's clearly unresolved. He dismissed his minister of defense last year, along with his foreign minister too. Essentially, they just disappeared from public and were removed from their offices. And there's been a whole suite of PLA corruption scandals, largely right now, most recently focused on the PLA rocket force, potentially related to some of their nuclear modernization. Also really related to their equipment development department, which is kind of the part of the PLA that manages procurement and things like that. And that's actually not surprising at all to me that those are two kind of the hotbeds for corruption. If you have a rapid kind of buildup of capabilities, I think you're bound to have corruption scandals, and they're going to be like really heavily located in the areas where it's about procurement, because that's where I think that's where corruption is most likely to take place. So I think that Xi Jinping sees that as a major problem. He sees political ideology and loyalty to the party as a key concern for him. He wants the PLA to not just be capable, but to obey. And so that is, I think, something that worries him when it comes to the PLA. The other big bucket of worries that I think the PLA has is they modeled their system to a significant degree off of the old Soviet system, where you have the regular command structure in place, but you also have this political track as well. So political commissars in essentially every level of the PLA who were there to focus on what I was just mentioning, which is that ideology and loyalty component. That's something that they borrowed from kind of the Soviet model and still have today. And so one of the things that I think they must be looking at is, at Russia's campaign in Ukraine is, how the Russian army and military has, struggled in terms of command and control, or command and operations in Ukraine because of their kind of rigid system, which doesn't, it kind of discourages some of the more, flexible and kind of experimental methods that the United States often takes. We often give, commanders in the field significantly more leeway to execute. We want them experimenting to some degree to achieve their missions. That's something that I think those more rigid structures like Russia's military and the Chinese military struggle with. So I think that's a concern for them. And I think that's why they're particularly watching the war in Ukraine closely.
Do you think that's something that can even be fixed in a country like China, where to an extent it's very unlikely that the political leadership would be willing to give up significant level of control over the military, especially when she is known for tightening the control over the society in general?
I think it's something that's possible in a general sense, that I think it's possible for a communist country to relax some of that and make the necessary reforms. But as you say, I don't see that happening under Xi Jinping. I see the opposite happening. Virtually every move that I can think of that he's made, from the military to the economic to political, has been to put the party at a stronger position, to make sure that at all levels, important institutions and organizations adhere to the party line. That's just, I think, ingrained in Xi Jinping's thinking. I think, if you think from Xi's standpoint of how their system works, if you had to make trade-offs between loyalty and capabilities when it comes to your military, you're probably always going to pick loyalty, because they can have all the capabilities in the world, but if they don't obey orders, if they don't obey the party especially, then at the end of the day, it doesn't all matter, and it may even be a bigger problem for them if they have a PLA that is not, that is becoming its own political force, and potentially even a rival political force. That's not something at all that we see in China right now, but with a weaker leadership, that is something that's happened in other states where the military just gains too much influence and becomes its own kind of factional force within domestic politics. So in the US, we think about this in terms of civil military relations. There, they kind of think about it as party military relations, and the party always has to win out. And so I think that's going to remain Xi's priority. And, I think he's willing to make sacrifices on PLA capabilities to keep them in line.
So another major difference between the Chinese military and the US military is that the Chinese military is basically being prepared for a single mission, and that is to retake Taiwan by force. Unlike the US military that is looking at many theaters and many possible scenarios and many possible opponents. And if we look at this mission that the Chinese military has been preparing for, how prepared are they now in terms of doctrine, strategy, equipment, training? How prepared is the Chinese military to take Taiwan by force if it were to happen now?
Yeah, I mean, as you say, that is their chief, mission and kind of conflict for which they prepare the most. I would say it's not the only one. I think there are a couple of other big theaters and areas where the PLA does need to remain focused on. Besides Taiwan, I would just highlight the South China Sea is a critical one. China, I think actually, I don't want to get too off topic, but I do think that if we're talking about the sheer likelihood of a military conflict, I think that the likelihood is higher that we'll see something in the South China Sea than over Taiwan. The stakes and the level of escalation there is, I think, significantly lower than Taiwan. Taiwan is not something that they're willing to negotiate on at all. But I think the likelihood of something in the South China Sea is higher. And so they do have to plan for those contingencies. The other areas that I would really highlight is the China-India border, which is something that, me and my team here at CSIS pay quite a lot of attention to. The PLA has been building up forces there in the last 4 years, and they still have significant numbers of troops stationed there. And that's with India, a great power in itself that is a nuclear power. So that's an area of concern for the PLA too. And then North Korea is another big one. And the PLA is also creeping more globally. They don't have this, forward deployed bases like the United States does. They still mostly operate close to home, but they have a base in Djibouti. We see them conducting like anti-piracy operations in the Gulf of Aden, things like that. So the PLA is steadily establishing more global footprint, but they are still, first and foremost, I think, training and planning for and preparing for Taiwan. On that front, I think one of the biggest things that we see them doing is potentially what I would call maybe stopgap measures. So they know where they're at across different areas of modernization. I think one of the things that they see as challenging for them is, if, of course, Taiwan is going to be a major, if you want to invade Taiwan, it would be essentially the largest military undertaking in history. If they were to achieve that, it would be bigger than, I think, Normandy and D-Day, in terms of the level of forces that they would need to get across the Taiwan Strait. And so that's a huge lift. I don't think the PLA does not currently have the kind of, the full lift, amphibious lift capabilities that they need to flow those forces across the strait. So we see them taking, again, stopgap measures. One of those is thinking about using commercial vessels, so roll-on, roll-off, or ro-ro ships. So thinking about how they can use some of those car ferries to potentially move, some battalions or things like that across the Taiwan Strait to supplement their lack of actual military lift capabilities. So they're still not they're not there, but the PLA is certainly focusing on that, and they're focusing on doing it quickly and getting prepared for that quickly. The last thing I'll say on that for now is, we have statements from, several U.S. officials and I think the intelligence community asserting that Xi Jinping has said the PLA essentially needs to be ready to take Taiwan by force by 2027. I forget the exact wording. Sometimes they say invasion. Sometimes they just say forcefully reunify Taiwan by 2027. That's not something we've seen in the open in terms of what the Chinese are saying themselves, but it is something that the U.S. intelligence community now appears to assess as has been the case. But I would emphasize that doesn't mean that's a timeline for invasion. That doesn't mean 2027's here and Xi Jinping just decides to invade Taiwan. It means he has set an internal, I think, immediate deadline for when the PLA needs to really step up its capabilities, and that's really just geared at getting the PLA whipped into shape as much as possible and as fast as possible.
Well, let's talk about the year 2027 maybe, because when I was in Taiwan, I've heard it mentioned from several, Taiwanese experts and officials that there is a worry that this is the year when a likelihood for an invasion would be particularly high. And the argument for that is that I've heard in Taiwan is basically that that's the year when the Chinese military advantage, especially in terms of quantity and industrial capability over the US, would be the greatest. And it would be before the economic and demographic problems that China has would really start to show a significant impact. And I wonder if you would agree with that assessment, and if 2027 is really a year when, that we should be looking out for.
I personally don't buy into that logic. I really don't think there's ever really a perfect window in terms of capabilities, because capabilities can shift very quickly. If you think about the economic slowdown China's facing right now, I think a lot of people weren't expecting that 2 years ago or 3 years ago. Somewhere on the economic side have been forecasting this for a long time, but I think a lot of people didn't necessarily see all of this coming right now. And so, things like that can pop up that really change that calculus in terms of capability side down the road. And I do think that there are concerns right now, given some of the things that I flagged, where like the U.S. industrial base is lagging, our shipbuilding capacity, just the sheer number of forces that we can field in given theaters, I think, is looking better in the 2030s than it is in the late 2020s, just because of the way force planning has gone in the U.S., which is a concern for me, or for the United States. But I think the one thing though that I would just emphasize really hard here is when the Chinese leadership, i.e. Xi Jinping and his top the Politburo Standing Committee, when they're thinking about using force against Taiwan, the PLA's capabilities are not the first factor that they think about. They think about, first and foremost, the political and strategic calculus. What is propelling them to use force, or compelling them to take force? Because I still believe that they do not want to have to take Taiwan militarily. I think they would absolutely prefer to do it peacefully so that they can, save blood and treasure. And I think that will more or less always remain their hope. So the question, if China is attacking Taiwan, it's what has led up to that? What has led Beijing think that is the time that they finally have to use force? Those political and strategic factors are going to be what decides things first and foremost. And at the end of the day, if there's overriding reasons in Beijing's mind that they need to attack Taiwan, I don't think that they care that much about the PLA's capabilities. They're going to demand that the PLA achieve it somehow. It's the political strategic necessity overrides the PLA's capabilities. So that I think is the most important thing. And yeah, of course the PLA, their capabilities matter, but I think that's not what's driving that's not what's driving the tensions right now. The tensions are largely at the political level, when it comes to tensions over Taiwan. And those are the main factors that are going to drive any kind of major crisis or conflict over Taiwan.
I think that's really interesting what you just said. I think two things, but the first one is, do you think that the Chinese, either military but mainly political leadership, still has hope that they would be able to take Taiwan by other means than force? Because if you look at the trends, again, demographic, but also political in Taiwan, you can clearly see that as the time goes on, the Taiwanese society is shifting more and more away from China and more towards remaining independent. So if I was sitting in Beijing, I would probably see this as increasingly more unlikely the further into the future I will look.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, like I said, I still think that the PL or the Chinese leadership prefers to take Taiwan, unify Taiwan with the mainland peacefully so that they don't have to, use the PLA and waste money and lives. But I think they don't have a clear strategy for achieving that, in my opinion. We've actually surveyed experts on this here at CSIS, and a lot of experts really don't think China has a clear strategy on this either because of what you just highlighted, which is Taiwan is culturally, socially, increasingly becoming much more distinct and different from the mainland. That is mostly true for the younger generations, especially. Older generations, I still think many have close ties, family ties with the mainland. They have linguistic and kind of cultural ties with the mainland more than this young generation that is much more identifies as Taiwanese more than they identify as Chinese. So that's a problem. But I have also heard from some Chinese experts, I don't know whether they genuinely believe this, or if they're just saying it, but I've heard some say that they don't trust all of that polling and that they don't see the Taiwanese trending this way as much as we do. I think they are wrong on that if that is something that they believe. But that's also one point I would make on this is strategic miscalculus is something that could very much lead us into a conflict. That China assesses Taiwan, misperceives something that Taiwan's doing or misperceives some major trend, or if there's an accident. That's worries me more than Xi Jinping just waking up one day and saying, okay, we need to invade Taiwan today. So I do worry about, what Beijing's ultimate strategy is and how the United States can shape our policies, shape our military and, other deterrents, but also our incentives structures with Beijing to make sure that they know there's always a peaceful resolution to this so that they don't attack Taiwan. That's the U.S. core goal here.
Another thing that you've mentioned and that I think is worth talking about is the basically the lessons from the war in Ukraine and from Russian invasion. And you wrote a great essay about that, but I'd like to look at that here as well. And in your view, when China looks at Russia's failed attempt to take Taiwan by force in a few days and the 2 years of war since, what do you think are the main lessons that it's taking away, either in terms of grand strategy and political decisions or in terms of what changes in the military they need to implement to perform better than Russia has?
Yeah. So my boss and I, Bonnie Lin and I wrote a chapter on this recently in a great collection that I encourage people to read, edited by Hal Brands at Johns Hopkins. But we are basically looking at what Chinese experts are assessing about the implications of the war and the implications for China and also looking at what we think China is actually doing in response. We list a lot of different things in there, but I'll just highlight a couple of the big ones. One overall geopolitical impact is I think they see the war in Ukraine as being a major global milestone and a precursor, both a cause and a symptom of more instability, global instability, and global divisions along, lines of democracies versus autocracies. They see that the world more fractured and dangerous because of it. We've seen some of them saying things like, it was the mark of the end of the post-Cold War era, and we're now in the post-Cold War era. So a new area of greater instability and danger. That's on the political side. On the military side, I think what we see, there's a lot of early lessons being learned. I think the PLA, I try to focus on what the PLA is really saying, and there's still a pretty big lack of public available information of what the PLA is thinking. But I think some of the initial insights that we are pretty confident about is number one, Russia simply failed to achieve what the Chinese call the three dominances. So the dominances in air, maritime, and kind of information space. They saw a big reason for that is they thought that I think Russia didn't go hard enough early on with things like missile strikes to degrade Ukrainian air defenses and things like that, and that allowed the Ukrainians to kind of persist in defending against the Russian invasion. So that remains, I think, a key failure on the Russians' part, and it's why we are in, why this conflict is so protracted. So magazine depth is another point of this. They've seen the industrial bases going at each other, and they now, I think, perceive that in modern conflicts like this, especially protracted ones, you need very, very deep magazine depth of, different missile artillery capabilities in order to kind of maintain a protracted conflict. So, and that has huge implications for Taiwan. And I think for them probably validates a lot of the moves that the PLA has been taking to advance things like the rocket force and build up those capabilities. A big one, this is kind of the last one I'll really highlight on the military side is they're thinking about U.S. proxy wars. So they view the Ukraine war as a proxy war of the United States using Ukraine to degrade Russia strategically. And they go beyond that and they say that this is actually a new level of proxy war. Some of them even call this an avatar war, or I think they use the word Fenshenren, which is like essentially avatar war, where essentially it's gone beyond just supporting Ukraine to providing so much equipment, training, and all of that to Ukraine that Ukraine is now like a mini United States that is able to, fight back against Russia at a much greater level than your typical proxy. And I think that they see that as what the United States would be doing in terms of defending Taiwan. And so there's a lot of lessons drawn there. And then the last overall thing that I think that they're learning and responding to is they see this war as kicking off a lot of major security concerns, from economic security like supply chains, to the overall external environment around China is much worse. It's caused worsening U.S.-China relations. So we see them doing a lot at home to level up national security. Even at the cost of, I think, economic development, they've really started to try to crack down on perceived threats to national security. And I think that is exacerbating some of the economic, concerns in China. I think it's, if you're trying to attract Western businesses into China to increase investment there while your economy is struggling, it's a pretty hard thing to do when you've just raided, U.S. and Western companies over concerns about national security, raided their offices and used their Ministry of State Security and other police to investigate those companies. So they're clearly concerned about security, and they're really making a lot of noise about that and focusing on it heavily. And I think that that's not entirely because of the war in Ukraine, but I think it's a big factor.
I think there are a lot of purely military lessons of how the war in Ukraine has been unfolding that I think are really applicable for, what we might potentially see in Taiwan or even in South China Sea. And one of them, I think that's particularly interesting, is basically how Ukraine has been able to decimate Russia's Black Fleet and how effective we've seen that relatively cheap naval drones can be to take down much bigger and really expensive ships. And I think that's relevant, especially for the Taiwan invasion, since China would have to, in case of it happening, it would have to use a large number of ships to get their troops to Taiwan. And we're now seeing that perhaps these ships would be a lot more vulnerable than we would have thought before. And I wonder if you're seeing China take a notice of that, and if you're seeing Taiwan take a notice of that and perhaps implement it to their strategy as well.
Yeah, drones remain a big question mark for me in terms of a Taiwan conflict. I know that drones would be used for surveillance and reconnaissance, um, and I'm sure for combat UAVs as well, and surface vessels as well. So I think that those are all certainly things that China is interested in and learning a lot about. Again, this also goes back to what I was saying about kind of cheap, dispersed, attritable forces. I think drones are the key to that. Um, and so certainly I think the PLA sees that as a potential thing that they need to deploy, or to modernize as they prepare for potential conflict over Taiwan. Like one of the things that I think we're seeing is them increasingly being able to field pretty robust drones that can take off from aircraft carriers and things like that, to give them greater coverage over the Western Pacific. So that's something I think we'll see more of. I think it's only going to go up in terms of the number of drones that we see. Drones are operating around Taiwan regularly, constantly in peacetime, and even further afield up towards like Japan and the Miyako Strait. So the PLA is already out there with drones, and we know they'll be present. I hope Taiwan is paying attention to this. They should be. I think drones would be those kind of attritable small drones that can degrade and kind of complicate the PLA's domain awareness, in the air and maritime space would be really important for distracting them, for holding their vessels at risk at a more affordable way. And it gives them, kind of redundancy beyond just relying on things like big manned aircraft and, shore-based cruise missile batteries and things like that. So it gives them other options. I think those are certainly things that they should be exploring and investing in. But yeah, it's a big question mark because I think militaries are still figuring out how to integrate drones into their doctrine. I think we're still kind of in the early phases of like thinking through things like drone swarms. Those are capabilities China can put together, but how they integrate them into their systems, I think is still a little bit of an open question.
I think this might be a good segue to talking about Taiwan and its preparedness for this conflict, because it has been, I think, perhaps to some people, criticized quite a lot for not actually spending that much on its defense, given the level of threat that they're facing, and B, the money that they do spend are often spent on equipment that looks good but might not actually be that useful. That they tend to buy jets and tanks and the big fancy equipment instead of maybe focusing more on asymmetric equipment that they could better use to leverage their advantage against attacking a larger opponent. And I wonder, what do you think about this criticism, and also how well, in your view, is Taiwan prepared for this scenario? Thank you for listening to this conversation. If you'd like to hear the rest of it, you can find it on my Patreon. Click the link in the description or go to patreon.com/decodinggeopolitics. And if you decide to become a supporter, you get bonus content, Patreon-only episodes, and you will be able to ask questions to my future guests. And here's what you can see in the bonus part.
One thing I increasingly worry about is the potential for a blockade that isn't initially designed to get boots on the ground on Taiwan. It's focused on just strangling Taiwan. A blockade that first and foremost starts with major firepower strikes against Taiwan. You could see a scenario where Beijing does all of this. It doesn't fire a shot at Taiwan, but pushes Taiwan to the point where Taiwan's only response is essentially to go kinetic. If they fire the first shot against the PLA, they know that creates challenges in terms of getting US and international support.